Hi, I'm the history guy. I have a degree in history. I love history. If you love history too, this is the channel for you. Today we're going all the way back to 1891 and almost to the ends of the earth, to the princely state of Manipur, part of the British Raj, where we're going to talk about one of the smallest and least understood of the conflicts of the British Victorian era and meet an unlikely heroine who deserves to be remembered. In 1858, following the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the rulership of India was passed from the British East India Company directly to the British Crown. This was called the British Raj, or the British rule. The Raj was administered two different ways. Parts of India were directly administered by the United Kingdom, and those were called British India. But there were also several small states that were nominally under the control of indigenous rulers under the paramountcy of Great Britain, and those were called the princely states. The two together were called the Indian Empire, and they were under the rule of Her Majesty Queen Victoria, who in 1876 added to her numerous titles the title Empress of India. Our story takes place in one of the princely states, the tiny state of Manipur on the far east side of India. To the west is the province of Assam, part of British India, and to the east is Burma, at this time also part of the British Empire. Now these princely states are under the suzerainty of the British Crown, and what that means is that while they have local rulers, the British Crown controls their foreign policy and their relationship with the rest of India. But in practice, Britain quite often intervened in their domestic affairs, especially if they thought it impacted the empire. And you can imagine what the local rulers thought of that relationship. Manipur had been a British protectorate since 1824, when the British had helped them resist invasions from nearby Burma. It was generally a good relationship. Manipur had provided troops to the British in the several expeditions to pacify Burma that eventually made it part of the empire. Manipur was about 22,000 square kilometers, had about 467 villages, including the capital of Imphal, a population of about 250,000, and in 1890 was ruled by the Maharaja Surchandra. Every princely state had a local political officer who represented the interests of the crown. As this was the local representative of the empire, they were usually called the resident, and the place they stayed was called the Residency. And in 1890, the resident for the better part of the last 3 years in Manipur was this man, Frank St. Clair Grimwood, who was by all accounts a dedicated and talented public servant. Grimwood lived in the Residency with his wife, the young and pretty Ethel St. Clair Grimwood. Life could not have been easy for an Englishwoman living in Manipur. She was literally the only European woman in the entire country, and she did describe it as being somewhat monotonous. But she seemed to make the best of it, working to improve the Residency's gardens and enjoying the local exotic pets. She had monkeys, she had otters, and even a bear that at one point became so troublesome that it had to be released into the jungle. Both Grimwood sought to learn the Manipuri language. They had a strong and friendly relationship with the Maharaja and the royal family, and they both seemed to enjoy a legitimate affection for the country and its people.
Manipur was a pretty place, more beautiful than many of the show places of the world. Beautiful in its habitable parts, but more beautiful in those tracts covered with forest jungle, where the foot of man seldom treads. Ethel St. Clair Grimwood, 1891.
Trouble came in 1890, when fights among the royal family led to an open coup. The Maharaja Surchandra abdicated his throne and fled the country. This shouldn't have been a problem for Great Britain. It was an internal affair of the Manipuris. And Frank Grimwood wasn't worried. He had a good relationship with all of the royals, including the new Maharaja. But politics is rarely simple. The old Maharaja appealed to the Viceroy of India, trying to get his throne back. And the Grimwoods knew that there would be trouble when they got news that J.W. Quinton, Frank's boss and the High Commissioner of India, was headed to Manipur and bringing with him 400 soldiers. The Viceroy's decision sounded strange. As the old Maharaja had abdicated, England decided that it would not support returning him to the throne. They would support the new Maharaja. But they decided they had to do something, and so the viceroy decided that they would bring troops and arrest one of the other princes who was thought to be the leader of the rebellion. Now, England might have been thinking that they were supporting stability, but in the eyes of the Manipuri, this was England stepping on their internal affairs and trying to take control of their country. And they did not take kindly to the idea of troops showing up to arrest the new crown prince of the realm. Events escalated quickly. The attempt to arrest the prince turned into a fight, and in all the shooting, several Manipuri civilians were killed. Then the British were in trouble because they were greatly outnumbered, and soon the Residency came under fire by cannon, which ironically had been given to the Manipuri by the British years earlier. Quintin figured out that his position was untenable, and so he sent a note to the Maharaja asking for a council of peace. And so Quintin, along with Frank Grimwood, and the commander of the British troops, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Skene, and 2 other officers, went to the palace to talk to the Maharaja. When the officers hadn't returned from the palace after several hours, it became clear to Ethel Grimwood that something must have gone wrong. And then, when the Residency again came under attack, it was clear that there was not going to be a peace, and that the surviving soldiers were going to have to try to escape to British India. But with the senior officers missing, the regiment was in disarray, and it seems that the person who rose to the occasion was Ethel Grimwood. Understand that Ethel Grimwood is just 24 years old. She's hardly eaten or slept in 2 days. She spent the last day in her own basement trying to help the surgeon treat wounded soldiers, something that would be horrifying for someone with no nurse's training. Her husband is missing, and she's being asked to leave her only home with all of her worldly possessions in it while under artillery fire. There wasn't even time to prepare, and yet she was the only person there who had any knowledge of the local geography, the local language, or had any hope of leading these 400 soldiers to safety. They had little food, could find very little clean water. She hadn't had time to grab boots, so her house shoes fell apart, and she spent most of the trip barefoot. Because they were being pursued by the Manipuri army, they had to avoid the roads, and in the trackless jungle, they would have been lost were it not for her knowledge of the local landmarks. But 2 days later, the little group managed to make it to another regiment and safety. Only later did they find out a horrible truth. The 5 officers who had gone to the palace, whom they assumed had been arrested, had actually been executed. And after her heroic journey, now Ethel Grimwood was a widow. Even while in mourning, Ethel was celebrated throughout the empire. She traveled to London, where Queen Victoria awarded her a medal, the Royal Red Cross. Newspapers heralded her the heroine of Manipur, the very symbol of grace and courage under fire.
And though it is not our vocation in life to be soldiers and to fight for our country, yet when occasion offers, I have little doubt that the women of England have that in them which would enable them to come out of any dilemma as nobly and honorably as the men. Ethel St. Clair Grimwood, 1891.
In the end, it was another sad story of empire. Quintin's miscalculation had painted both he and the Maharaja into a corner, with fatal consequences for Quintin, but it didn't exactly work out for Manipur. In response, England raised a huge army, conquered Manipur, killed or arrested the entire royal family, and placed a 5-year-old boy on the throne, in what is still described in England as a mutiny and in India as a fight for freedom. But around that sad story, the courage of one person stands out: Ethel St. Clair Grimwood, the heroine of Manipur. I'm the History Guy. I hope you enjoyed this edition of my series, 5 Minutes of History, short snippets of forgotten history, 5 to 10 minutes long. If you enjoyed this 5 minutes and you want 5 minutes more, then please click like and subscribe.